Awesome. Welcome to the Gamification Revolution. I'm your host, Gabe Zickerman. It is a somewhat sunny early fall day in New York City. Can't complain. So happy that you're all here with us. Thank you for joining. As always, we're here to talk about subjects related to engagement and gamification, how those things will impact you in marketing, in advertising, and human resources, HR at the enterprise, EAA. For those of you that don't already know about it, want to give you a heads up that this fall, starting actually in just a few weeks, I'm going to be traveling around the world with our new event called G Summit Global. You can catch some of the best thinkers in the subject of gamification and engagement joining us all around the world. They're going to be joining us via video and live. We're going to be doing live meetups in 12 different cities. I'm going to be doing a hands-on workshop where you can earn a gamification certification live and in person with me, which is fantastic. The address is gsummit.com. I definitely want to encourage you to check that out, join us and visit. For those of you who are watching live today, be sure to click the login button. And once you do that, once you authenticate with Facebook or Twitter or your login credentials, you can actually join the conversation. You can be a participant with all those great people chatting in the right column. You can ask questions, which will come on screen. I'll bring those on and you can get your questions answered by Jim and I. Or if you actually have a camera and you want to ask questions, you can click the camera button and we'll bring you on and you can ask your question live and in person, which feels maybe invasive, but it's not really, so don't worry. Okay, so our guest today, Jim Wexler, expert on engagement and gamification. Jim, welcome.
Thank you.
So, question for you, Jim. You have a long and storied history in engagement, in advergaming, and so on. So tell me why, just in your thought, why is it that it's so difficult for advertisers to understand the core concepts of what makes a game or gamification truly interesting? Put another way, why is so much advergaming kind of crappy?
Well, it's an interesting question, and you'd think that things would have changed over the last 15 years and that people might have come around a little bit from the marketing and advertising side, but it's always a challenge. I think that the fact that even in a digital and interactive era, that the bulk of advertising and marketing communications is one way is a factor in why games and game-based communication can be lackluster for brands. If you take it all the way back, I've been doing this for a little while. In the early days, really going back over 10 years, all the games we created had to be handcrafted. We made the first game for Coca-Cola and the first cereal box game for General Mills and did Taco Bell and Pizza Hut's first games. They were all in a pre-web or an early web era when these games were going to be delivered on disk, believe it or not, and they were delivered for media and also for promotional purposes. Back then, we put everything we had into those games and they were unique deliverables, but it wasn't too long after that that the ability to deliver what could be called a game became commoditized, and marketers didn't recognize the value of truly immersive gameplay. They said, well, we've got a little web game and we've got that box checked, and the quality fell off. And the idea of differentiation, which they put into everything they have in design and print and video, somehow seems to have escaped them when it comes to creating quality games that feature their message.
So that's an interesting thing. You said check a box, which is often how I describe the marketer's view of games or any new technology, right? Social has been subject to this as well. It's like, we have to do social, let's do social. So what's going to be different though this time around with gamification? I mean, other than really bright people like you who kind of come up in this, how are we going to make sure that gamification and marketing this time around isn't as banal as maybe it's been for advergames?
Well, I think first off, it really is a matter of quality. If you think about even, because I know you've got a lens in and you've got a lot of experience with this, there are plenty of marketers. Now that we've finally, thanks to your lead largely, got gamification front and center, and every CMO and every senior marketer now recognizes it's on the radar screen, they're more than too glad to check a box, and there's a lot of box checking going on in this space. There are people who, and some of them I've been interacting with over the last few days, who are adding point systems or badge systems or using a piece of enterprise software to gamify what they're doing. And in my opinion, they're leaving a lot on the table. They may have added the system to their communications, but they haven't necessarily done something immersive or captured the brand essence or captured what's delightful about games in their deployment. So it's a confluence of forces. If you have service providers who tell you that they can automate this process of creating gamified experiences, you might gravitate that way. In my opinion, it's going to be people who look to game designers or game makers to create gamified brand experiences who will end up differentiating and succeeding. And
So this
I
is
hope that's where this goes.
so this is a point of contention. So what you just said, which is we need game designers and game experience designers to make this really work, is basically the exact opposite of what Rajat Paharia, who you might know from Bunchball, founder of Bunchball, former IDEO designer, author of Loyalty 3, what Rajat said, which is actually game designers mess up the problem of gamification or the question of gamification. And just to add kind of to the color of this, I have mixed feelings about that, Jim. I'm not sure that I know if game designers are great at it. I know that they make certain mistakes, and in other cases they don't. Why do you think that game designers, after a history of kind of like, let's just knock off Angry Birds for this brand, why do you think all of a sudden game designers are going to be able to do something that's more meaningful? Is it really game designers' fault that things haven't been meaningful?
Well, meaningful is a good word, and I think that even the guys from Bunchball, they are game designers too. It is a matter of opinion. It might be a matter of semantics, but if you're taking game dynamics and game mechanics and applying them to communications, you're a game designer. If you're remembering to make the experience an activation of content, which for me would be making it meaningful and giving people a goal and having that goal be vibrant and stirring, then you're more likely to build a relationship with that person, whether it's internal for enterprise or whether it's a consumer. I've always thought, I went to your first G Summit, and I come from the game making side, and when I went to that first G Summit, I couldn't understand who those vendors were. I asked them, where are the games? I didn't understand. And I didn't really believe it, and I still am on the fence about whether you can create a gamified experience and not deliver something that's game-like. Meaning,
Well, wait. How can
I
you be
don't
on the
believe.
fence about that, Jim? I mean, the
Well,
evidence
maybe
to support the evidence to support that. I mean, look, the biggest advergame in history, in your view, is what? What do you think is the most successful
because I,
advergame in history?
oh, I don't know. When we did,
Just
I don't know, but
Yeah. Okay. We'll take any example that people are interested in, like the United Airlines Optathlon, which I think is an interesting example. The first one that came to mind, Matt Me design. Okay. So at its peak, United Airlines Optathlon driving about 100,000 people through the experience. Now,
right.
a gamified system like My Coke Rewards or the Pepsi system or even Tabasco Nation, which are not games in the classic sense of the word, the number of users are order of magnitude larger. Nike Plus is 150 times bigger. So I don't really know. I don't know if we can keep arguing on the advertising front about which method is necessarily better or worse, just based on the data. My real question to you is, I'll put it a different way. Do you think marketers can get it? I don't doubt that smart and clever and creative people like you can design awesome things. It's not you that isn't producing the stuff that's amazing. My sense of it is once it gets inside corporate America and you've got the VP of marketing who's trying to figure out how to engage customers around their particular brand, isn't that where this all ends up falling apart? A fear of trying something different or new or interesting there?
Well, first of all, I think that some of those programs, they are gamified. Those are loyalty programs or reward programs that are made that much more effective, incrementally more effective by adding these dynamics and motivating people to participate through these systems. Those are effective. And if the question or the word is, are these things effective? There's absolutely no doubt. But the idea of creating an experience that is more immersive or more memorable or more stirring is probably where I'm going. So, I don't want to.
Do you mean like in the real world? Are you
Pardon me?
thinking about the physical world or just in people's computers?
Well, maybe in both, because certainly I'm talking about digital deliverables for the most part. If you're talking about an electronic delivery, like we were talking about earlier with the gamification vendors. They are saying we can spur or goose participation through these dynamics in digital experiences. I would say that the engagement level on those, I don't mean not only eyeballs, but not necessarily, or participation, but true engagement benefits from the experience being tied to something a little more meaningful than the extrinsic and
What's more
by
meaningful? Let's take a. This is one of the things that's really interesting to get inside your head a little bit here. So when you say more meaningful, how do you reconcile that when you're sitting in front of somebody who's making cold cuts? What's the meaningfulness in selling sliced ham, and how do we discover
who,
that deeper meaningfulness?
well, you work hard to find out what underpins their experience. You're talking about the worker at this point. How would you motivate that worker at 7-Eleven who's, is that what you
I'm
mean?
I'm talking about the consumer, right? Now, I'm all into meaning. I'm not questioning actually whether or not there can be meaning there. I'm interested in your process as somebody who really thinks about how to design these things, Jim. How do you take something, a brand, let's say, on the facing the consumer side, or even the worker side, things that are not that exciting, things that have a utility purpose. I use smoked ham, but we could use key making or key cutting as an example.
Or
Things that
anything,
have
yeah. Well,
utility.
that's the job. All right, I understand the question. In a word, it would be learning. What is it that we can teach that person, or what is it that would be involved with learning that would improve their participation? And I say learning because, as you know, play is how we learn. So if you can put someone into a situation where we find out for the ham purveyor or the key maker what it is that we want them to learn and how we can add value to their understanding of their own lives or the topic through learning, that's where the value is going to come from the game dynamics. There's learning in everything. As you may know, a lot of the clients that I end up doing this for have an awful lot to teach, and a lot of times it's boring or complex, and they need to unbundle complexity and underpin the benefits with clarity. Financial and healthcare and insurance are the kind of topics. Ham is hard, but I would say, but we can go back to Coke as well. What on earth would Coke have to teach its consumers? And I would say they better find something and align their brand with something that has learning value, and that's what they should focus on if they want to use game dynamics. Now, the promotional end of it, the rewards game system is an aside. It's promotional and it's driving traffic and it's tied to reward. But to me, rather than the badges or the prizes, the use of game dynamics as a value to a brand, whether it's for their own workers or whether it's for an external consumer, is finding where the learning is and
So that's
activating that.
So that's really interesting, right? And I often have made this observation too. It feels like a lot of these really great gamification examples are actually about teaching. So, and unveiling it. Domino's Pizza Hero is often the example I use for that, which is this very popular game that Domino's built that teaches you how to make a pizza. And by the way, they're making $1 million in incremental sales a week from the game, and also generating a lot of leads for job applicants through this process. And it's all about teaching people how the sausage is made. So how important is it for somebody, from your perspective, someone who's done this a lot, talking to people who are interested in figuring out how to gamify things, how important is it for the designer of these experiences to be really good at teaching and understanding educational processes, scaffolding, curriculum development, all that kind of stuff?
Well, on some levels, it's important. There's two aspects to it. I thought you were going to ask how important is it for them to have subject matter expertise in what's being taught. But the first part of the question, generally
Also an
speaking,
interesting question. Yeah.
yeah, generally speaking, the game designer is
I think that Jim's cut out a little bit, but this kind of learning observational thing that we've been talking about before, that I was talking about, is something that actually to me has been a really, really fascinating experience. It's something that I'm becoming more and more aware of. And from my perspective, I actually think it's quite important for a gamification designer, for somebody interested in creating gamified experiences, to actually know how to build something like a educational structure or a foundation to be able to teach somebody a subject. I think we have Jim back. I think we lost
Yes.
most of what you just said, Jim, but I'd love to hear it again from your perspective.
Well, and I
Both
have
of
to tell you, it was a completely brilliant answer too, Gabe. That's the sad part. The
you. Well,
What I was saying was that on a certain level, a game designer is an advanced form of instructional design in and of itself. The notion of putting out content in a way that leads to self-discovery, in which choices are made, and in which the participant has the illusion of, at least, of free will to make choices and then get coached or feedback based on those choices, is an instructional design protocol. So while it is true that particularly if you're making games for training, it would serve a game designer well to be versed in traditional instructional design, I believe, as most of the time when we create something like this, they are. Even without that, game design is an advanced form of instructional design, and could serve to
and to the
bring
second
engagement
thing,
to learning.
so the second thing that you brought up, which is the question of subject matter expertise, how important is subject matter expertise? Like when you work with a client, and that we want to hear a little bit about your business too, which we'll get to in 1 second. When you work with a client, how deep do you feel like you need to go in the subject matter? How much of an expert do you need to be in how the ham is made to be able to help someone with a ham project?
Well, it's incredibly important. When one day you're helping doctors articulate bedside manner better in a simulation, and then the next day it's investment bankers, and the day after that it's insurance brokers or salespeople. For the experience to be authentic, all of the content has to be utterly accurate and depict best practices. Usually, we end up leaning somewhat on clients to bring their own subject matter experts, as well as a lens in on culture and so on, in order to deliver that authenticity. But we almost always, because clients tend to not want to write or work on behalf when we're doing these programs for them, we bring subject matter experts to the fold. It's a subject matter expertise is then siloed from the work of the game design lead and the production team, because they are providing content that has to be translated to the world of game design, and it'd be rare that you'd find both. An insurance expert is a good game designer, or vice versa.
I think anyone who's actually dealt with insurance experts knows that that's probably not true. So Dutch asked this interesting question actually before we dive in a little bit more on what you've been doing. So Dutch was asking, one of our regular viewers, hi Dutch, thanks for being here. He's asking about questions like presentation and user interface, and I want to make that a little bit bigger. From your perspective, how important is the visual design of an experience, especially when you're designing a gamified experience? How important is that at actually being successful? Are there cases where, the visual design, I know visual design is generally important, but are there cases where you've really said, you know what, let's not overinvest in the visuals, let's just focus on the mechanics, and that's been equally successful? What's the balance there?
Well, it's part and parcel. Visual design is incredibly important, usually because these are very complex topics. Think of it as a game interface just for a second. That means we've got the experience itself and resources and coaching and overlays and point structures, and all of these things need to be laid out in front of the user with considerable simplicity and directness. So visual design, to keep there from being too much junk to clutter up the experience, is very, very important, so that things are discovered appropriately and brought to the fore appropriately. Users, game players, are very used to multi-channel interfaces and a lot of complexity. But on the enterprise side, or when we're doing this for corporate clients or for end consumers, depending on the audience, you often will not make the assumption that they are going to be able to handle tons and tons of incoming data. So it's a very careful job of delivering an interface that works effectively.
Now, what about in that? I mean, and that I think everybody probably gets that inherently. What do you think about the challenge of how most game interfaces are a little bit foreign or challenging for older adults? And I think there's this, there's this kind of, I mean, I don't know how you describe it, but there's a general way that we think about most like video game interfaces with the little scoring up at the top and the characters in the middle and you're moving around. When we use those, or if we use those in broader context, whether that's consumer or enterprise applications of gamification, do we sometimes run the risk of creating interference? Are we throwing something up when we don't really need to do that in order to be able to connect with the consumer? What's been your experience on the use of game interfaces like avatars, 3D, and so on good gamified design?
Well, first of all, you talk about the audience and older consumers would, like you, I've been at it for a little while. The objection that our older consumers might not be oriented to these kinds of experiences goes away a little more each day. This would have been unheard of 12 years ago, and now it's a far more common occurrence. You know, we like to talk about the kids under 50 who operate our workforces and our enterprises, and they've all spent either 30 years at work with iteratively complex interfaces, or they've grown up with them. But having said that, it's very important to key to audience, and if it is a older audience, our users are I don't know, 40 plus as opposed to a broader demographic, you have to be very careful not to overload them. The tendency, again, we're talking about a lot of times things made on behalf of brands where you may have an eager marketing communications person who's really ready to overstuff the experience you're delivering with their content or with multiple aspects of content, and you have to opt for simplicity. What's most important here? I had a case study. We were talking to this was a provider of construction materials in the Midwest a couple years ago, and they were laying out. They said there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of things that could happen to the customer as they try to learn about our product. And we really said to them, well, I'll bet you there are 10 that happen 98% of the time. I'm sure as an expert, you've got hundreds, but why don't we focus on the 10 that happen to everybody all the time and put our efforts into making those clear, and the others will be an asterisk, or we'll do that round two. And it was very clarifying, and that tends to be the thinking. Trying to boil down to what is really important, both in behavior drivers and in content or aspects of the subject itself are key. And sometimes there's a little slash and burn, and it's difficult, but that's the key.
To me, it feels like, I don't know if you feel this way, to me, it feels like a lot when I work with clients, especially big company clients, we're a little bit of a combination of therapist and designer, where I'm kind of going in and they've called us in to do a gamification project, engage a group of employees or engage a group of customers or figure out a better way for this to happen. And we actually end up taking all these big steps back. What are you really trying to achieve here? What are your core goals? What are the main metrics? You know, the kinds of things that we teach in gamification workshops at the beginning. People want us to come in and start throwing around game elements at problems immediately, like, hey, aren't we just gonna make stuff into a game? And when we do this, we end up in this kind of weird position. It's a much deeper role than probably most people would expect. Can you talk about that and tell everybody just for a minute or two what Experiences Unlimited is and what it is that you guys are doing? What's your current project?
Sure, I will. And you've reminded me of when I was talking about that first G Summit I went to in San Francisco, which was an incredibly exciting event. And when I walked in, and I'll answer the question, but when I saw those gamification vendors who were promising to automate the delivery of game experiences or gamified experiences, and I was standing there with a seasoned consultant next to me. We were both looking at these vendors and saying to ourselves, are they kidding themselves? Meaning, is it really just a Trojan horse for them to go in and consult? How can you gamify someone's content before you truly understand that content and can get underneath what they're trying to articulate and communicate? And since most clients need help in clarifying or articulating their core drivers or the core message, doesn't the consultant come first? And we wondered if it was truly a software business, or is it really a consulting business masquerading as a software business? So it's a big, big question. And for me, I come at it from the message development side. I've always been a brand messaging consultant or a enterprise messaging consultant. And so I'm sorry, I had to fix the screen for a sec. And so that for us has always been how we go in, and in a certain way, being in this niche of game-based learning or game thinking is a way in to talk to these folks, but many times, most times, we end up having a conversation about what they're trying to communicate. And while as universal as game dynamics can be, sometimes the answer isn't a gamified experience at all. They either need to clarify their message, or there's something far more straightforward that they need to do first. So you hit the nail on the head that
What's the Experiences Unlimited story? What's the quick story about what you're doing now and what projects you're working on now?
well, I'll tell you, our company is a specialist in bringing game thinking to marketing communications and consumer marketing. We specialize in first this messaging aspect, and then the delivery of game-based learning, gamified apps and such to help people solve problems and motivate their people. About half of our business is on the internal side at companies. Most of these companies are larger companies that for years now I've had a competency in creating game-based environments and simulations that depict business process and show the human-based scenarios that occur within that process, a day in the life of a company, or a day in the life of their people or their sales force or their customers, in order to provide text and get people involved in what it is that a company does. And that can work either internally, or that same thing can work when a client has context to bring to a customer or to a B2B enterprise customer. And so we spend our time working on projects for large companies in financial services and healthcare and in insurance, where they are trying to up the engagement level of what it is that they're trying to teach their customers or their workforces.
So do you find this kind of surprising, like I do? So when we first started doing this gamification thing like 3 or 4 years ago, I had really high hopes that finance industry would be all in. Early days, no finance people to be found anywhere, not really engaged with the discussion. Today, it seems like the finance industry is really leaning in, to use a phrase, really leaning in on the question of gamification. What do you think is the unique challenge for folks on the finance side trying to make either work or the consumer engagement more interesting?
Well, the one that they would say first is regulatory. They're all concerned about regulation and making sure that what they deliver is appropriate and legal. But that aside, I think it's fair to say that in financial services, marketing isn't what comes first. The business is driven by the business, and so there are many marketing people in financial services without a business background, and they're seen as a nice to have. So that was the early barrier. I think the reason you're seeing uptake now is there are some good examples and case studies where it's been effective for large financial organizations to engage their customers, and there's a lot on the line with some of these customers, and engage them effectively through this kind of delivery. I would also say that they have a lot to teach their customers. The banks and the investment institutions that I've been working with lately are starting to recognize that this is another way to build a relationship with an end customer, and even more importantly, a way to equip their front line, which is either a wholesaler or a financial advisor, to sell through to the end customer. It's a way to add value. Customers don't understand this stuff at all. They don't understand their investments. It's front and center in their lives, and they're scared, and they're confused, and it's too complex for them, and they feel stupid because they don't understand it. And it's just, we're at a little bit of a tipping point where financial services companies are seeing that it is a true way to build a relationship that matters and differentiate themselves, because these companies are commoditized. There's no difference between one fund company and another, really, other than the person you talk to who's trying to sell it to you, and maybe your ability to believe that they're going to help you understand while they sell to you.
Yeah, fascinating. And of course, in the chat, which is always very spirited, having the discussion about those executives in particular being afraid of fun. And one person who's not afraid of fun, everyone, Jim Wexler, of course. You can follow Jim on Twitter at Jim Wexler. Jim, thanks so much for being here with us this week. It was fantastic to have you here, and I know that everybody would benefit from getting a little bit of your experience in the mix. For those of you who are regular viewers of the Gamification Revolution, so happy to have you here. Thanks for being with us again. Please remember to join us at G Summit Global this fall and winter. I might be in your town. Hopefully you'll be able to join me there live and in person or all online. And we'll be back again next week at approximately the same date and time as we usually try, with another great guest to talk about different subjects and engagement. Again, thanks so much, Jim.
My pleasure. Terrific to see you again.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We'll see you next week again on the Gamification Revolution. In the meantime, I'm Gabe Zickerman. Keep having fun.